Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Neal, aka Dragonette on iNaturalist. I'm one of the international organisers, as is Stephen, Peter, and Thomas, who are with us tonight. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Great Southern BioBlitz acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today and who may watch this in the future. Over to you, Thomas.
Great. The way I'll run this one tonight will be slightly different to how I've run my beginner workshops previously, if any of you guys have attended those. For the beginner ones, I tend to have a fairly structured presentation in terms of starting off with how to make observations and then going through to how to ID your own things, how to add things to projects, how to ID things for others. Whereas for tonight's one, it'll be a bit more all over the place per se, and kind of just jumping around from tip to tip. And certainly, as usual, feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat whatsoever, and I will get to all of those. So I'm gonna jump into things. Okay, so as I said, tonight we'll largely just be going through a whole lot of I'll say advanced, but certainly features of the platform that hopefully a lot of you aren't aware about, and hopefully I'm teaching you some new things. And mostly tonight it's dealing with these little tips and tricks and extra features that just make using the platform a lot more streamlined and allow you to access more information in different ways than what you normally would. So the first thing I'm going to go through is annotations. So this is something that I'm pretty sure I've touched on previously in some of my presentations, but they're kind of this very underrated aspect of iNaturalist. So what I mean by annotations, for anyone who isn't familiar with them, is if you go to any given observation on the platform, so let's say we'll go to this moth that I found in my house the other night. You'll see that if I scroll down on the right-hand side of the page, underneath the map, you'll see there's a big heading here, Annotations. Now, these differ depending on what taxon you're dealing with. So they'll look different if your observation is of a plant, or if it's of an insect, or a different type of animal, or a fungus, and so on and so forth. But largely, these are ways to add additional metadata to your observation that aren't necessarily captured or aren't necessarily, I should say, conveyed by the photo alone. And what I mean by that is you can specify whether your observation is alive or dead, or cannot be determined. Well, that's usually a fairly rare case. So in this case, I could say that my organism is alive. You've then got a relatively new one, so evidence of presence was only added in the past few months. And this includes, at the moment, for animals, molt, organisms, scat, and track. So this is a really great way to add additional metadata if you've taken photographs of footprints or poop or an insect molt or any kind of trace of an organism that isn't necessarily the organism itself. And this is all leading to something, by the way. I'll show you the great benefits of adding these annotations in a second. But in this case, I can just add organism because it's obviously the entire thing. You'll notice that when I clicked evidence of presence, a second one appeared as well. So it will actually allow you to add multiple annotations for evidence of presence. So for example, if you had a photograph of a dragonfly that was in the middle of molting, you could add both organism and molt as your annotations. Then you've got life stage, which is the kind of typical stuff that you would imagine. You've got egg, larva, pupa, and adult. So here I can click adult. And then finally, you've got sex, where you've got male, female, and cannot be determined. I will leave that one blank for now. So keeping in mind, there is no obligation to fill out all of these annotations. but I'll keep this one blank because I actually have no idea, even if you can determine whether or not this species is a male or female. So what we have is we now have 3 extra little tidbits of extra metadata that have been attached to this photograph. And just as one more example before I talk about why these things are beneficial, I'll show you what it looks like for a plant. So if we go to one of my plant observations, you'll see that they're different. So you'll see that now there are only 2 annotations. One is for sex, which obviously doesn't always apply to plants because you've got some plants that are both male and female at the same time. So that can be a tricky one depending on the case. But you'll notice this new annotation, which says plant phenology. And when I go to look at the values, you'll see that it's flower budding, flowering, fruiting, and no evidence of flowering. So in this case, if we zoom in on this abhorrent photo of this euphorbia, you'll see that you can see little fruits. So these little green globules are the fruits. So what I can do, so I can go plant phenology and add fruiting. And you'll notice exactly like that other annotation on the moth, you'll see that plant phenology is still available for me to add another annotation. And indeed, you are able to add all of these annotations. So obviously, if you've already clicked fruiting, then you'll notice if I click X here, you'll notice that no evidence of flowering will disappear once I actually click one of these 3, because obviously these are all evidence of flowering to some degree. So I can click my fruiting, and obviously if the plant also happens to have some flowers on it or some buds on it, I can click all of those as well. You'll notice that I was able to get rid of my annotation. So if you realize that you did an incorrect annotation, you can just click the X and it will remove it. The other thing you'll notice are these agree and disagree buttons. So this is largely for annotations that other people make. So if you go to someone's observation and you see, for example, they've said that an insect is an adult, but when you look at the photo, you realize it's actually a nymph. You can actually downvote that annotation. Now, it won't actually change it. Only the person who added the annotation can change it. But it will remove it from this other pool of photos that I will show you in a second. The final thing to note with these annotations is that you can actually do this on anyone's observations. So if I go to, so you don't have to just do it on your own. So this is a really cool way of being able to contribute data to iNaturalist, even if you're not identifying something for someone, or if you're not adding observations, you can also contribute data in a meaningful way through this channel. So if I go to this observation that someone else has made, you'll notice that I can go to plant phenology and I can click flowering. And I've just now added an annotation for them. Just quickly check the chat. Okay, yeah, so Claudia makes a good point. So giving your annotation a thumbs down doesn't give a notification. So that's absolutely 100% correct. If someone adds, as I said, an annotation of adult to an insect that's actually a nymph, if I click the thumbs down, it won't actually tell them that I've clicked the thumbs down. So if you do see an incorrect annotation, the best practice always is just to leave a comment on the observation, letting the person know that they've made a mistake and could they please change that annotation. Now, the reason that these annotations are so important is for being able to browse photos of specifically that type of annotation. And what I mean by that, so let's say that I want to look at caterpillars of the butterfly meadow argus. Now, normally I would have to browse through all these other photographs and have to go through all the adults. There's one caterpillar, but now I'm having to scroll through all these photos of adults. And so far I've only found one caterpillar. And indeed, if I scroll all the way to the bottom of the first page, which is 96 observations, there is only a single caterpillar on the entire page. There are actually 2 different ways of being able to find just those caterpillar observations. The first is by editing the URL. So for people who have been to a few of my talks, I've mentioned URL editing and how powerful it is a number of times. One way that you can edit the URL that I don't think I've really touched on in previous presentations is being able to specifically search for certain annotations. Now I'm just going to go to the wiki because I always forget the exact string of text to type in. Go to here, and go here, and we get rid of this. Okay, where are our annotations? Okay, so it's mterm ID. So what you want to do is you want to first add the string ampersand, so the and symbol, and then term underscore ID equals. Now in this case, life stage is the number 1. So we will add number 1 there. And then I specifically want a larva for caterpillars. So then you add the string and again, term underscore value underscore ID. Caterpillar is, larva I should say, is 6. Now press enter. And now you'll see that I am only looking at observations that have specifically been tagged as caterpillars of meadow-argus. So that's a really handy way if you only want to look at, say, caterpillars of particular moths or butterflies, or indeed the opposite, if I was only interested in looking at adults. And what I would do is I would change that to the number 2. So if I go value ID equals 2, I'm now looking at observations that have only been tagged as adults. But one thing you'll immediately notice is that this number is considerably smaller than the true number of adult observations of meadow-arguses. And the same thing goes for caterpillars. And that's because these observations will only appear in this format if they have been annotated as such. So if I put up a meadow-argus observation and it's an adult, but I don't annotate it as an adult, it will not appear in this specific search for adults. So that's one really important reason for annotating your observations where you can. It's just that it makes it a lot easier for other people when they're trying to search for specific life stages or phenology stages or things like that. So it's a really nice, it often won't really help you out yourself a lot. It's not really going to benefit yourself tremendously, but certainly it's often a great service to other users who are looking to refine their searches. Now, there's also one further way to do this as well, which is if you go to the taxon page for a particular species, and you go to this view that you're familiar with, you'll see that there's actually this button here which says View More. And what this button does is it will take you to pretty much all the different photos across all those different observations I was just looking at. And here you can see, instead of having to edit the URL, I can just pick all my filters along the top of the page here. So you'll see here at life stage, I can pick adult, larva, pupa, or egg. So here I've clicked larva, and you'll see that again, I'm seeing all the different caterpillars of meadow-argus observations. One way this is more beneficial, in a sense, to looking at it in the other way, is that, let me just duplicate the page. And if I go back to the previous view, you'll notice that this is organized by individual observation. So you'll see that there's 17 observations here. However, some of these observations have multiple photos. And the benefit of using this view is that it shows every single photo individually, not every single observation individually. So instead of having to go to each observation and check out all of the photos within each one, if you do it this way, you can actually see all the photos at the same time. So similarly, if I change to adult here, I'm now looking at all photos that have been tagged as adults of meadow-argus. And then if I want to click any, I'm now looking at both caterpillars and adults. So does that make sense so far to everyone? So annotations, you can also do this on the app. Can you? I think you can do this on Samsung app. I'm not 100% sure if you can do this on, I don't think you can do this on the iPhone app from memory, but I believe you might be able to do it on Samsung. But certainly when you are on the desktop, it's very, very easy to add annotations to each of your observations. And then, as I've mentioned, it makes it a lot easier for other people when they're searching for particular observations. I'll just quickly go through the chat before I move on. Okay, no worries, no questions so far. Okay, now there's one final aspect of the annotations, which is really helpful in terms of generating this extra data. And I'll use a flowering example for this. So if we go, what's a good example? Let's go dusky coral pea, because they seem to be out in force at the moment. And I've seen a lot of observations of dusky coral peas at the moment. So if we go to the About page for dusky coral pea, you'll notice that next to the photos, there are these really interesting graphs. And these graphs are actually contributed to, again, by the annotations. So the first graph that you have is just seasonality. So this is any observation whatsoever of this species. And you'll see here that they peak around August and September. So most of the observations that people are making of dusky coral peas tend to be around August and September. But if we skip to this tab which says plant phenology, you'll see we now have things broken down in terms of their annotations. So I can now see exactly when this plant is usually flowering. And you can see that the biggest peak, so the red in this case is the flowering, and you'll see that the biggest peak is in August. Whereas in September, it starts going down and starts dropping off until you have January only has 2 observations of them flowering, February has 0, March 0, April 0, May 0, June has some. So here we can see, at least for the observations that have been annotated, the total flowering period for this species ranges from June all the way to January. Now, of course, some of those may just be spot flowering and not within the actual true flowering period, but we can certainly tell definitively that flowers of this species have been observed from June all the way through to January. And you can do that for any species that you like. And you'll actually see here, the vast majority of observations of this species have actually not been annotated. So you'll see just for the month of August alone, there are 180 observations with no annotation versus 34 total that do have an annotation. So certainly annotations at the moment seem to be this kind of 1% aspect of the site, but they are picking up and a lot of people are increasingly annotating their observations more and more, myself included. So that's something that I would highly recommend all of you doing whenever you get the chance. So Nakala said, can you do deep searches using the app? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by deep search. Are you able to clarify that for me? And while you're clarifying that, I might move on to the next part. So just crossings off my list. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be jumping around from place to place. So we've done annotations. One thing I'm just going to talk briefly about is hidden coordinates. So as hopefully everyone here knows by now from my other presentations, whenever an observation of something that's threatened or endangered or vulnerable gets uploaded, it will have its, in most cases, it will have its true coordinates obscured and randomly scrambled. And those coordinates essentially become hidden. And the same goes if you decide to manually obscure your coordinates. But there is a way, if you want, for other people to view your coordinates or for you to view other people's hidden coordinates. But it does require personal interactions between those users. So if I go to my profile, and then underneath my profile picture, I click the big blue button, Edit Account Settings and Profile. And then I go to Relationships here on the left-hand side. You'll see that for all these people, so that here by default, it's the people that I'm following, but I can actually search for any user in this bar. You'll see that there's a little tick box that says Trust with Hidden Coordinates. If I tick that tick box, it means that that user will be able to see any of my obscured observations. So obviously, to prevent this feature from being abused, you cannot tick this box for any other person. I'm the only one that can trust my own coordinates with other people. But this is a really nice way if, let's say you've set up a project and you're partnering up with some kind of local land care organization or the local government, and some of the people from those organizations would like easy access to the obscured observations that you've uploaded, then what they can do is they can set up an iNaturalist account for themselves if they haven't already. And then each of the users that are contributing to the project can choose to trust that user with their hidden coordinates. So that's just a kind of very simple, very fast way to allow access to obscured observations to particular individual users. But obviously, this is something that you shouldn't use lightly, and you really should take the trust aspect very seriously, and really only use this when necessary. But it is a nice feature and quite a simple solution to the issue of obscured coordinates. So Nakala clarified, so in terms of the searches, so using the filters that I showed before, e.g. adult and flowering. So on the iPhone, no, because as I've mentioned many times before, the iPhone app is very much bare bones. So you cannot search using those filters on the iPhone. The Samsung, I'm not sure, to be honest. So that is something that I've been a little bit lazy with. I really should one day get someone who does have the Samsung app to show me all the features so I know exactly what it does and doesn't do. But I will say perhaps. I won't say definitively yes or no, but you may be able to do it on the Samsung app, but definitely not on the iPhone. And Christina asked, is there a re-veg versus planted and a wild versus native plant annotation? So there isn't an annotation for re-veg versus planted. There is a way to mark plants as wild versus not wild and native versus non-native, but those are not annotations. They're a different way to mark things. And what I'll do is I'll actually go through those right now. So those two are two different separate things, actually. So the first one we'll go through is marking something as wild or not wild. And this is one of the most important parts of the site. So you can do this on all apps in the desktop. On the desktop, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of your observation and keep scrolling, you'll see that there's this big section called data quality assessment. And this is where you have a whole lot of different parameters where this is basically deciding whether your observation will move to casual or not. So this is where you can upvote and downvote all these different categories. So I'll just briefly go through them. So for the ones where you can vote on, so date is accurate. So let's say that there's a particular type of insect that only emerges in 1 month during the year, or there's a particular type of plant that only flowers in 1 month during the year, without exception. And someone uploads a photo of one of those things showing either the insect or the flower, and it's during the complete wrong month. And you think that for whatever reason, they have the wrong date for the date of observation, whether they typed in the wrong date or the metadata that they had was wrong, or maybe they took the photo from someone else. What you can do is you can downvote here for date is accurate, and then you'll see what happens. You'll see that now my observation is casual. So it's moved from needs ID to casual. Whereas if I click that vote back off, you'll see that it's gone back to needs ID. So the same thing applies for all these other categories. If I click a downvote on something, it will move the observation to casual. The reason that the upvote exists is to balance out downvotes. So let's say that someone comes along and for whatever reason says that they think my observation of this plant is not wild here. So this is the wild / not wild thing that Christina mentioned. So for whatever reason, they think the organism is not wild. They think that this is a plant that was planted in a garden, and they can downvote. What you'll actually notice is that if I come along and I say, oh, someone's downvoted this for some reason, and keeping in mind, whenever you do these downvotes and upvotes, there is no notification for the user, exactly the same as the annotation vote and downvote. The user will not get a notification. So it's really important that if you do mark these things, to send a comment to them so that they know that you did it. If someone goes along and marks this and downvotes it, I can actually upvote, and my upvote will actually balance out their downvote and it will move it back to needs ID. So that's just a way of correcting erroneous annotations that other people have made on your observations. So the location is accurate one is pretty much exactly the same as the date is accurate, the same concept. You know, someone takes a photo of a flower like this, but then let's say they put the location out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Well, you can say obviously something went wrong when they were uploading that observation. You can downvote the location is accurate and then just write a comment to them saying what you've done and could they please fix the location. And then once they've done that, you can remove your downvote again. Evidence of organism is pretty much where they've got a photo and there's nothing in it, essentially. So this is for things where, say, someone takes a photo of a blank wall and there's no observation in it. So that may be possibly they uploaded the wrong photo accidentally from their phone, or there was a bug in the screen, in the shot, I should say, but then as they took the photo, it flew away. Those are some cases where you can downvote evidence of organism. This one isn't used so often, recent evidence of an organism. So one kind of obscure rule that not a lot of people know about iNaturalist is that ideally your observations should represent organisms from within the past 100 years. And what this means is that you shouldn't really be uploading observations of fossils onto iNaturalist. You can upload them, you know, there isn't anything stopping you, but what will happen is that you need to press this downvote on your own observation, saying that it is not recent evidence of an organism. But to answer Christina's original question, if you take a photo of a plant that you clearly know has been planted, so it's in your garden, it's in a pot, it's like a council planting in your local park, it's a street tree on the median strip, and what you need to do is click this downvote to organism is wild. And so that will indicate that the organism is captive/cultivated. Same thing goes for animals. So it's not just for plants. If people upload photos of their pet dogs, their pet cats, fish in a tank, you can downvote organism is wild as well. The other aspect, which is, let me just go back to it, native. Okay, yep. So native versus non-native. So this is a bit of a tricky one, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. I'll just answer two other questions first. So Bastian said, can you explain the difference between casual and needs ID? So every single observation by default when you upload it is needs ID, right? That's the one that you'll see most often. And then when people come along and identify for you and multiple people have confirmed the identification, then it will move to research grade, as everyone knows. But there is a third category called casual. And there are many, many reasons why things can be casual, but these include if any single one of these have been downvoted. So if any of these 5 categories have been downvoted, your observation will move to casual. So if the date is inaccurate, the location is inaccurate, there is no evidence of the organism that you said is in the photo. If it's a fossil, or if it's a captive/cultivated/non-wild organism, all of those will make your observation go to casual. If your observation is missing a photo entirely, it will be casual. If it's missing a location entirely, casual. If it's missing a date observed, casual. If it's been flagged for being inappropriate or for copyright infringement, which none of you will have to worry about, but on a regular basis as a curator, I have to deal with observations where new users don't quite understand how the site works. And what they'll do is they'll say, upload photos that they found online that they belong to other people. So that's a breach of copyright. Those have to be removed. So that also makes an observation casual. Every now and then you get cases like school kids that will upload photos of each other with rude hand gestures or things like that. So those will get flagged as inappropriate. That will also move your observation to casual. So those are all different ways that your observation can be moved to casual. The consequences of something moving to casual is that it will move out of the standard searches that people make. So for example, if I just search for observations in Greater Sydney, and then I have a look at what the default filters are, you'll see that by default on all standard searches, the verifiable box is ticked. And verifiable basically means that it's either research grade or needs ID. So you'll see here 206,763 observations. If I untick this verifiable box, I'm now also looking at all the casual observations, and you'll see that that number has jumped up considerably. But by default, casual observations are essentially invisible in most standard searches. Okay, so Mark said, looking at location is accurate. When an observation location is obscured due to the rarity of a species and the apparent location is moved to an unsuitable habitat, what to do then? Is there a flag? No, so you leave it as is. So if an observation has had its location moved to apparent unsuitable habitat due to the obscuration, do not flag it as location is inaccurate. And you'll always know when it has been moved due to obscuration because it will look like this. So this is a very bad example because I'm looking at my own observation and I can see the true location. So let me look at someone else's one.
You can try one of mine if you like, Thomas.
All right, so here we are. So this is what you'll see. So if you see any observation that has been obscured due to it being endangered or otherwise, there will be a big blue box and the circle itself will be bright blue instead of orange. So if you see a case like this, do not downvote the location is accurate. But in all other cases, by all means, downvote that location. But then to also reiterate what I said, make sure you leave a comment for the user. Otherwise, they'll have no idea that you actually downvoted it unless they accidentally stumble upon the observation again. But certainly, if you see this big blue box, it means that the location has been obscured. Claudia then said, I've had some observations marked as ID is as good as it can be at family or genus. Does this mean it will stay at casual? Okay, so that's a good question. So this is something I've mentioned in previous observations as well. There are many cases where, particularly for things like invertebrates, an observation cannot be identified to species from photos because the identifying characters might be obscured, or maybe they're internal, maybe they're microscopic. Or maybe, you need flowers to identify this plant and it's not flowering. What you can do in cases like that, where you 100% know that the ID cannot be improved from what it currently is go all the way to the bottom and click this box here. No, it's as good as it can be in response to the question, based on the evidence, can the community taxon still be confirmed or improved? So you can tick, no, it's as good as it can be. Now, this will do one of two things. If your observation has more than one ID, so here it's only got one, mine only. If it has more than one ID and it's at a level below family, that's really important. So if it's two or more IDs and a level below family, it will move to research grade. So your observation can actually be research grade, even if it's not identified to species. So if you have an observation that's at genus, tribe, subfamily, so on and so forth, it can be research grade if you tick this box. However, if your observation is currently ID'd to family or above, or if it only has one ID, ticking this box will actually move your observation to casual. So I do not recommend ticking that box unless you don't mind it moving to casual, if that is the case. So if I had only ID'd this to class or order or family, and then I tick that box, it will become casual. So John said, offsetting the location for privacy to a nearby street junction would make your observations casual. Nope, it'll be completely fine. It'll still be needs ID or research grade. The obscuration and offsetting totally ignores things like habitat suitability. So that's completely fine to do. Okay. So on to the next random thing. So one thing that you'll notice if you're becoming an increasingly more regular iNaturalist user and you're making more and more IDs and more observations is that you'll notice that you'll get more and more notifications, of course. As you interact with more and more observations and then other people interact with the same observations, of course, more and more notifications get generated for you. But in a lot of those cases, those notifications are chaff and inverted commas. So for example, if I identify someone's photo as a magpie, if 5 other people come along and also say that it's a magpie, that will give me 5 notifications. Now, some people don't mind getting those notifications, and that's completely fine. But from my personal perspective, I find those really irritating because I don't need any notification that 5 other people have also said that this is a really common species and have agreed with me. All I'm interested in is if someone adds a comment, or if someone tags me, or if someone adds an ID that is different to mine, so that I can go and review and see if I need to change mine. There is a way to do that. So if you do not want to receive notifications for IDs by other people that just purely agree with yours, you can remove those. So if you go to your profile, then you go, again, big blue button, edit account settings and profile. And then on the left-hand side, there's an option that says notifications. You can turn, this button will by default be turned on for you. You can turn it off. So you'll see it now says, if you turn this off, you will no longer be notified about IDs that agree with yours. And that applies to both your own observations and other people's observations. So any circumstance where you have added an ID on an observation, and then someone else comes along and adds an identical ID, you will no longer get a notification if you turn this off. The only exception to that is if I ID something as a magpie, and then someone else also IDs it as a magpie, but they also attach a comment to their ID, I will still get a notification for that. But if it's just purely an agreeing identification, I will no longer get notifications. And you can turn that on or off whenever you like. And just remember to click Save Settings. So that's just a good way. If you're getting very few notifications, then there's no real need. And some people really enjoy getting notifications that other people have confirmed what they've seen. And that is, of course, completely fine. But everyone is different, and I know for a fact that some people find them annoying. So that's just a nice way to turn those off if that is the case. Now, so Lydia said, can you upload if you are wanting an ID? What exactly do you mean by that? So do you mean, can you upload an observation even if you don't know what the organism is? Is that what you meant by that? So just while I wait for Lydia to clarify, yeah, okay, yep, so that's completely fine, 100%. So if you don't know what something is and you want to upload it, all you have to do is identify it to the best level that you know how. So if you took a photo of a mushroom and you have absolutely no idea what it is, all you have to do is just say it's fungi, and that's completely fine. And someone else will come along and identify it for you. If all you know that something is a plant, you can just ID it as a plant. Even if you have zero idea what phylum it is, you can literally just identify something as life, and that is better than leaving it blank. So, if I find something and I have no idea if it's a slime mold or a fungus or some wacky organism, I can literally type in life, and that is a valid ID, and that's completely fine. And then Nikala said, I think a number of these features are unavailable on the phone. Yeah, 100%. So if you've got the iPhone app in particular, probably 90% of this functionality is not available at all on the iPhone app. There's a lot more functionality on the Samsung app if you've got that. But certainly iPhone app is super bare bone. So if you want to do any of this, anything that is remotely complex, you have to do it on the desktop. The app, and especially the iPhone app, is largely just for making observations in the field, and it's used for its convenience. So what I'm going to go into now is placeholders. So these are another kind of slightly hidden feature that not a lot of people are aware of, but they're a really important thing. So if I go to upload an observation, you'll notice, and I start typing in that this is a spear thistle, you'll notice that you have to click on the drop-down option for it to actually appear as an official ID. If I was to just type in spear thistle, but I didn't click any of these drop-down options, you'll see that it disappears. One other thing that you'll see happens, if I start typing in here, you'll see that there's actually this thing here, use species A as a placeholder. And what you'll see happens is this creates an observation that simultaneously does and does not have an ID. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So let's just say that this is some rare species that I found. And I know the name, and it's called species A. But when I type that in, let's say it's called species ARPO. You'll see that there's no option. Species ARPO isn't in iNat's database. So I go search, external name providers, no results found, use as a placeholder. I then submit it. Being especially slow tonight. Yep, Sebastian said, seems impossible to look up users and follow them on the app. Yes, definitely concur with that. Okay, so if I now go to my observation, very much being slow. You'll see that it actually says unknown for the ID, but then in brackets in small gray text, it says placeholder species A. So it has retained what I typed in, even though that wasn't an official ID. However, watch what happens when I type in an ID. So let's say I'm another user. I have come along and I've encountered this observation that seemingly does not have an ID. I don't know what it is, but I just know it's a plant. So I type in flowering plant. I add my ID. Watch what happens. My placeholder disappears. Now, in a lot of cases, the placeholder disappearing is totally irrelevant because a lot of times people will add a placeholder that's something like bug or flower or leaf or something like that. And so it doesn't really matter if it disappears. But in a number of other cases, those placeholders are really important because they'll have the actual correct species name, and it's just that they weren't in the database in iNaturalist. And as soon as you add this ID, it disappears. So there's two reasons that I wanted to highlight this to you guys. The first is that you should always pay attention. And one thing you'll notice is that if I delete my ID, you'll see that the placeholder comes back. So that's one way to retrieve it, is if I delete my ID. So the number one important thing here is that if you are identifying observations for other people and you see that the observation has a placeholder, never just type in an ID if your ID is not the same. So if this said species ARPO, and then I knew I could type in species ARPO and it would work, totally fine. You don't need to type anything. If I was just going to add an ID of flowering plants, what you need to do is also indicate what the placeholder was. And that's just a way of retaining that information so it is not completely wiped out. So that's just a really nice piece of etiquette on iNaturalist, is if you see someone has an observation and it has a placeholder, and you're adding an ID that is different to said placeholder, please just type in what the placeholder was, just so it's not completely lost. However, there is another way. I'm just going to, just so someone doesn't jump in and ID this in the meantime. There is, however, another way to retrieve placeholders. So if you saw someone's observation and saw that had a placeholder, and then you happen to stumble upon the observation again later, and you see that someone had overridden it and they hadn't typed out what the placeholder was, what you can actually do is go to the search bar here, and at the end of the URL, type in .json and then enter. It will take you to this page, which is full of an intimidating wall of text. And then you'll actually see, if you search for the phrase placeholder, let me get this down. If we search for placeholder, you'll see that it actually retains the information. So you can see that there where I've highlighted. If you search for placeholder on that page, it actually keeps the information. So this is just a nice way of, if you realize that someone has accidentally deleted a placeholder and you can't figure out how to get it back, this is where you find it. You add .json to the end of the URL, and then you search for the word placeholder on this page. You do that by doing Control F, and then you can find it there. So then I could go back, and now I know that this used to say species ARPO. So I'll just delete that observation for now. So does that make sense to everyone? So that's just, it's not a feature of the site that you'll encounter hugely often, but it is something that you will encounter from time to time. And it's just nice to make sure that you try and preserve that placeholder if you can. Okay, now we come to a situation where, let's say I am typing that species ARPO and it's not in the database. Well, there's two different things you can do. So if you upload an observation of some kind of rare or unusual species, and you definitely know what the identification is, but you start typing it in and it doesn't appear, there are two different ways that you can get that species added to the database. The first is here. So I click into the suggestion identifications bar, and I type in species ARPO, and you'll see that no options appear. The very first option you should always do is this button, search external name providers. And what that does is it basically gets iNaturalist to do a quick search through a whole lot of external databases that are connected to iNaturalist. So this will search through things like Encyclopedia of Life, I believe Plants of the World Online, World Register of Marine Species, and probably a few others. Catalogue of Life, I think, as well. And often that will retrieve the species for you. So you click this, it'll say loading, and then more often than not, it will actually give you a result here. And then you just click it, and then you've basically imported that name into iNaturalist, and away you go as normal. But sometimes, if it's a really obscure species, because of course there are millions of species on Earth, and there are constantly new species being described every single day. And so it takes time for them to be added to databases. And sometimes they're not only not in iNaturalist, but not in any of the major external databases either. So in those cases, if you get a no results found, what you need to do is flag the taxon. And what I mean by that is, so let's say this was a particular species of Apiomorpha. I would go to Apiomorpha. So I would go to its taxon page. I would scroll down, and here, just underneath this graph, there's a button which says curation. I click that. I then click flag for curation, which will take me to this screen. And I can say, please add species ARPO. And then I click flag it. And what this does is it will create a flag. On the home page, all of the flags appear here on this screen. And then basically curators can see these flags and they will be able to manually add the species for you. So what that looks like, so this is not something that most of you will be able to see unless you're a curator. So this is a box that I can see. I can click create a new taxon. And this is the page, again, that you guys won't be able to access this page. But this is the page that I see. And this is where I can manually add new species to iNaturalist. So those are the two different ways of getting new species into the database if they're not already on iNaturalist. So it's 9:21. I probably will go to 9:45. So this was meant to end at 9:30, but as usual, I'm running over time. So if you do have to go by 9:30, certainly feel free to go. This will continue to be recorded, I'm pretty sure, Michelle, until 9:45. Is that okay?
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome. So if you happen to miss the last 15 minutes or so, you can look at the recording on either the Facebook page or the YouTube channel for the Great Southern BioBlitz. So the next thing I will go is a little bit more URL editing. So again, this is something I've mentioned quite a few times previously about how you can edit the URL here and do all kinds of fancy searches. So I will do a very brief refresher on that, very brief, and then do one or two little pieces of information that I don't think I've explained before in previous presentations. So one thing to note so this is the one refresher I always do, is that you can actually view two different taxonomic groups at the same time. So let's say I wanted to look at observations from Greater Sydney. So I type in Greater Sydney. And then specifically within this area, I wanted to look at observations of grasshoppers. So I type in grasshoppers, and that's really simple enough. I'm now looking at observations of grasshoppers from Greater Sydney. But let's say that simultaneously, I also wanted to look at observations of scorpions. Now, normally I wouldn't be able to do this, right? Because if I typed in scorpions here, it immediately overrides all my grasshopper ones, and I can only see scorpions, right? And the lowest common ancestor between the two would be arthropods. So if I wanted to look at them, both of those groups, I'd also have to look at every other single arthropod at once. But there is a way to only look at scorpions and grasshoppers simultaneously. One thing you'll notice whenever you search for either places or taxa is that in the URL, a little identifying code will appear. So here you'll see that the ID for Greater Sydney is 142,327, and the unique identifying number for scorpions is 48,894. If I go back to grasshoppers, you'll see that their unique number is 700,600. So the way to view both scorpions and grasshoppers at once is what I do is I figure out what my number is for grasshoppers. I just copy that number or remember that number. So it's 700, 600. I now go to my search for scorpions. What I do is I go here, I add a comma after the number for scorpions. I then add in the number for grasshoppers. But most importantly, you'll see here there's this little string of text which says and taxon ID. As soon as I add in a second or a third or a fourth number, I must change this to plural. And I have to add in the S there for taxon underscore IDs, otherwise it will not work. So I'll show you what happens if I don't have the S. You should just get a blue screen. So this is what will happen, and it's just totally blank. Whereas if I add in the S here, you'll see that it now works, and I am now looking at all observations of both scorpions and grasshoppers in Greater Sydney. So we'll just scroll down a bit and find one of the scorpions. There was one right at the top, but we'll see if, yeah, there we go. So we're now looking at observations of both scorpions and grasshoppers simultaneously. However, I can also exclude things in this way. So if we go back to just Greater Sydney, so we've got Greater Sydney, and let's say I want to look at all of Orthoptera. So Orthoptera basically covers all the things that look like grasshoppers. So that's grasshoppers, crickets, katydids, king crickets, wethers, raspy crickets, you name it. But let's say that I am not interested at all in looking at katydids. I want to see the grasshoppers, I want to see the crickets, I want to see the raspy crickets, but I have no interest in katydids. I can also exclude the katydids from my search. So again, we'll see that the number for Orthoptera is 47651. And then if we search for just katydids, you'll see that the number for katydids is 48124. So what I'll do is I'll copy that. I'll go back to my search for all of Orthoptera, and I add this string of text and without. So I type in without underscore taxon underscore ID equals, and then the number for katydids. So you'll see at the moment, the total number of observations is 1,331. Now watch what happens when I remove katydids. It now goes down to 874. So now I'm looking at all of Orthoptera except for the katydids. And one little interesting thing, and I have no idea why this is the case, let's say I want to exclude a second group of organisms. So let's say I want to exclude the grasshoppers, and I only want to look at the crickets, raspy crickets, and king crickets. So what I do is I look up the grasshopper number. From memory, it was 700, 600. Yep, 700, 600. So I add my comma, I add my 700, 600. You don't actually need to, and in fact, you cannot add the S here. So whereas for the taxon ID part, if I want to look at multiple different taxa at the same time, I have to add in that S to make it plural. For whatever reason, when I'm excluding taxa, you do not add the S. You just leave it as the singular. So now you'll notice that the number will drop down dramatically. Now I'm looking at all of Orthoptera without grasshoppers and without katydids. So I'm only looking at things that either have just been identified to Orthoptera or things that are crickets, raspy crickets, king crickets, mole crickets, and so on. So that's just one little important thing to keep in mind. If you're chaining multiple taxa together that you want to look at the same time, you have to make it plural and taxon IDs. Whereas if you're excluding multiple taxa, it has to stay singular. Why that's the case, I have absolutely no idea. It makes no sense to me, but that's how it is. And if you don't do those things, it will not work for you. You'll get a blank screen. How much time have I got? I have got about 15 minutes. Excellent. Okay, so one situation that people will often encounter is they'll identify something for someone or add a comment to someone's observation, and then as some kind of illustrative example, they'll want to add a photo to their comment. At face value, it seems like you can't, but it is actually possible to embed photographs in comments on iNaturalist. So what you can do, if I go to one of my observations, sending needs ID. So let's go to one of my really old observations. Okay, so let's say I had figured out what this was. Let's say I had figured out what species this was. Let's just say it's a snapper, even though it's not. Let's just say it was this species. And let's go back to my observation. So let's say that I wanted to say, I've figured out what this is. It's this fish. And then I specifically wanted to add this photo of this fish. Now, keeping in mind this would be copyright infringement because it's not my photo, but let's just pretend this is my photo. And I wanted to add that photo to my comment. Now, normally I'd kind of have to go to this website. I'd probably have to click the link, go to here, and just add the link. And I'd say, see the first photo. And and I could add that comment. And that's a really cumbersome thing to do. Instead, I can actually directly embed that photo in this comment. And the way you do that is like this. So let me just delete this comment. So what I can do is I can say, I've figured out what this is. Compare with this photo. So now what I do is I type in the less than symbol, IMG space SRC equals sign, open bracket, close bracket, greater than sign. And now in between the I should say not open bracket, the quotation marks, all you need to do is go to here, right click on the photo, click copy image address, go back here, paste it in between the quotation marks, and then click done. And you'll see I now have a photo in my comment. No worries. Thank you for joining in, Bastian. So this is actually a really cool way to embed photographs in your comments. You can do this with absolutely any photograph whatsoever, as long as it is online somewhere. So I'll just delete that. So I can do this from my own observations. So if I go to another one of my observations, so let's just say here's this observation I have. So all I have to do is right click on it, go copy image address, and I do my and I've now embedded the photograph in my comment. So it's just a really nice way that instead of having to post a link to another photograph, you can just put that photograph directly in the comment itself. Okay, now I think I'll just do two more things. And these involve particular filters and ways of searching through things. So one thing you'll notice that when you're on the Explore page, there is this set of very handy
didn't you get a text?
filters. So a lot of them are very self-explanatory. So things like you can tick to only see wild things, only captive. You know, you can see observations that only have been made by a specific person or that are only in a specific place, and those are quite simple. But two filters that are perhaps not used as much are rank and sort by, and these are really nice filters. So by default, you'll notice that I'll do sort by first. The default ones are date added and descending. So what that means is that you'll see your observations in order from left to right, top to bottom, in what you have most recently uploaded and going downwards, as I said. So your most recent observation that you have uploaded will be this one at the top left. And then as you go down, they become older and older with respect to when you uploaded them. Now you can actually change this order if you want. So I can actually change it to ascending. And now it's in reverse order. So this is the first observation that I ever uploaded, and then progressively older in terms of the upload date. I can also change that to date observed. So now this is the oldest observation I ever made in terms of when I saw it. So this is a crab I took a photo of 16 years ago. This is a shell I found 16 years ago, crab I found 15 years ago, so on and so forth. Whereas if I then swap that back to descending, I'm now looking at the most recent observations I've made. So here's a bee that I saw yesterday. Here's a moth that I saw 4 days ago, so on and so forth. You can also change this to faves. Now, this is a very dodgy filter. Don't ask me why, but it certainly does not work well all the time. But what it does is it basically puts all of your most favorited observations up the top here. So if you want to look at the observations that most other users have favorited, so you can see here 5 favorites, 3, 3, 3, so that's the little star symbol, 3, 2, 2, 1. And then here you'll notice where it starts to break down because it's meant to be in order, but this one has 1 favorite, but then randomly there's more 2s after it, 2s, 2s. This one doesn't have any favorites, yet somehow it's up here at the top. So keeping in mind that that is a very dodgy filter that certainly does not work in a lot of cases for some strange reason, but it does put most of them to the top. So it works in a lot of cases. The other filter is rank, and this is a really, really nice filter that you can use. Mostly, I guess, for identifying purposes. So let's say that I have uploaded loads and loads of flies over the course of my time in iNaturalist. And I had a rainy day, or I was in lockdown from COVID, and I had some spare time, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go back through all my old observations of flies, and I'm going to find all the ones that I never managed to ID, and I'm going to try and make an effort at identifying them. So my first step is I'll type in flies. I now see my 771 observations just of flies. And now it's seemingly a very laborious process to one by one scroll through all of these and have to scroll through both the things that I have ID'd and the ones that I haven't ID'd and just pick out the ones that I haven't ID'd yet. So seemingly this is a very long and arduous process, right? But there is a way to only see the things that you have not ID'd, and that is with the rank filter. So you'll see at the moment, it's just set from high to low. And what that means is it's encompassing every single taxonomic rank within flies. So flies are in order. So that means it's encompassing everything from order down to subspecies. Let's say that I only want to look at flies that I have identified the species, what I can do is I can change the high rank to species and the low rank to species. And now you'll see that I'm only looking at my observations that are exactly identified to the species level. So you'll see that every single one of these is only identified to species. But let's say I want to look at things that I've never managed to ID. What I can do is I can set this back to high. And what I can do is I can set this to say family. Now I'm only looking at observations of flies that I have made that are identified to a family level or coarser. So you'll see family, 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 infraorder, order, so on and so forth. So these are all the ones that I haven't managed to get to genus or species. So if you want to look at a specific, like an explicit taxonomic level, then you make them both the same. So if I set them both to be family, I am now looking at all my observations of flies that are ID'd to family. So that's just a really nice extra little filter for your observations. And Shirley said, if you have a list of observations and select one, can you move to the next observation in the list without coming back to the list? So do you mean if I click on this, it takes me to this page? And then if I want to go back to my others, I have to click back and keep doing that for every single one? Is that what you're referring to? Awesome. Okay, so there's two ways to get around that. One is, fairly clunky, but it's probably the simplest solution, and that's just to right-click and click Open Link in New Tab. So this will work on any browser. So I've now got that observation opened up in a new tab, but I've still got all my other ones here that I can look at. So it's just right-click on the photo and then click Open Link in New Tab, and that'll open up for you. The other way to do it is through the Identify screen, but that's a bit trickier and you have to add a whole lot of different filters. And the reason for that is by default, the Identify tab isn't meant to show you your own observations, but it is possible. So let's say that, I'll do this very quickly and then I'll get on to the last question there and I'll wrap things up. Let's say I want to look at all my observations of the family, of the fly family Surfidae. What I do is I click Identify, and now I'll need to set up multiple filters here. So this is why the right-clicking and opening a new tab is just a lot easier. So first thing I'll have to do is I'll have to click Filters. I'll then have to click Research Grade as well as Needs ID. I'll then have to tick Your Observations. I'll then have to search for Surfidae. And I will have to tick the box Reviewed. So those are the four things I'll have to do. So what I'm now looking at is all of my observations of hoverflies, pretty much. So that is one way, and you'll notice here that you can just bring up each one, and then you can just page to each one, and this will not get off the page for you. So that's the second way of looking at all your observations at once, but you've got to do those multiple things. You've got to tick this research grade box, because by default, only Needs ID is ticked. You've got to tick the Your Observations box, and you have to tick the Reviewed box, because by default, anything that you've uploaded for yourself has been reviewed. Okay, so the final question I'll take, and I'll wrap things up. So Kathy said, can you export a list of your observations, e.g. Excel? Absolutely. So this is using the export tool. So at any time, you can export data from iNaturalist, whether it is your own observations or other people's observations, and it will give you a CSV, which is a type of Excel file. So what you just need to do is just go to Google and type in, if I type properly, export, iNaturalist export. So there is a way to actually do this on the iNaturalist page itself, but I can never remember the pathway. So this is the first link that will appear. It'll say, how can I use it? You just click that. And then here, at this part of the text, you'll see it says export tool, and there's a blue hyperlink. You just click that. So once you're here, so you can actually just, bookmark this URL if you want. This is where you can download data from iNaturalist. So this is basically your one-stop shop. What you would do is you would go here to user, and I would type in the beachcomber. And then you click enter. It'll start loading. You'll see that it's got all 22,500 of my observations. You will be able to tick any of the boxes here you like. So there are 1,000,001 different filters here. So you can choose only observations that have photos, only ones with sounds. You can pick research grade or needs ID. You can pick these things, which will take too long for me to explain here in the few minutes I have left. But those are basically, you can pick observations that have other people have identified it for you or not. You can pick your observations that are captive. You can pick your observations from only a certain place, certain taxon, observed on one day of the year, from a certain project, from a certain date range, so on and so forth. You can then pick all these kinds of different columns that will be downloaded with your observations. So you can untick or tick however many of these that you like. And then you just go down to the bottom and you click create export, and that will then give you a CSV file of all the observations that you have specified. One thing to note here, or two things to note, I should say. The first is that all exports are limited to 200,000 observations at once. So you cannot do a data download of more than 200,000 observations at one time. If you are trying to do a huge download of, say, 500,000 observations, which I've had to do a few times for papers that I'm writing, you have to break it up into chunks. So usually the way that I do that is with the date range filter. So I'll say, okay, I'll just get all the observations from 2019, download those in one go, all the observations with the same filters, but just from 2020, so on and so forth. And you have to do it in chunks. The other thing to keep in mind is that the more observations you add to your export, so the bigger it is, and the more of these columns that you add, the slower it will take for your observation, for your export to be created. If I have a very small export, so let's say I'm just trying to export 1,000 observations with just a few of these columns, it'll probably take 15 or 20 minutes. Whereas I've done exports before of, say, 150,000 observations with a lot of these columns, and it took 2 or 3 hours for it to work. So for most of your cases, I suspect it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I think most of you guys will be doing fairly small downloads, but just keeping in mind that if you are doing a particularly big export, so this is what will happen. So I click create export, you'll get this little window which says exporting, loading, check back later. There's two options here. One is you can actually press this button, which is you'll get an email automatically when the export is finished. Alternatively, you can just leave this page open, press refresh, and you'll see it says processing here. And then once your export has been done, so you'll just have to every now and then refresh the page. Once it's done, it'll say done, and then there'll be a button next to it which says download. And you can actually cancel this at any time. So I can just press here and delete. But so these down here, you'll see these are actually free downloads that I did earlier this morning for a paper I'm writing at the moment. So once they're done, they just have this download button and it will download a zipped CSV file to your computer. And then you can just unzip that and view it as normal. So Laura said, can annotations be exported to? Not via this particular screen. So you cannot export annotations via this screen, but there is a different, more complicated workaround, which will take a while to explain. So if you did specifically want annotations to be downloaded, definitely feel free to message me or email me at any point, and I can explain how to do that. But the short answer is no. That export screen won't allow you to download annotations for each of those observations. but it is possible through a different, slightly trickier method. But we have hit pretty much 9:45. I think we'll wrap things up there. So unless people have any other last second questions, as usual, if anyone has any issues or needs any help with any aspect of the site at any time whatsoever, feel free to either message me at the Beachcomber on iNat or send me an email. And I'm very much happy to answer any requests or inquiries at any time whatsoever.